something outside here or there. I tried to walk over. I had to go through that. Well, it says here, so. That's what I remember. Right, I know.
Partially that, but also partially COVID, because I moved back to Pennsylvania to be close to family. It just
What?
weird. Yeah, it made sense.
Now we go. So you're in the whole house.
I am.
That's
Unfortunately,
yeah, no problem.
And who shops it for years right now?
that was
I was like,
yeah, I remember I saw Lori a few times going in and out.
Yeah, she's lovely. When she met her, she taught me. And so are you the one who was thinking about
Radio! Welcome everybody. I'm Tom, and this is the Row House Forum. And you're in the right place if you came to hear Alan Weaver speak about Palestine and Israel. At the Row House, our tagline is engaging current culture with ancient faith. And I believe that's on my new improved coaster / business card. Be sure to take one home if you haven't yet. You will not throw it out because you'll put your beverages on it and you'll keep it forever. But yeah, so with the Row House, engaging current culture with ancient faith. And there's some groups that are really good at understanding and interacting with popular culture and current events. And then there's groups like mine, I think, I'm probably better at sort of sticking with the ancient streams of wisdom, ancient realities and history. And when you choose to do that, somehow that ends up being very relevant. This is the perfect example tonight. You may think that there was conflict in Gaza, and Israel's back in the news, and they have a new government and all that stuff. But actually, we planned this over a year ago, I think, to have Alain come and speak. It shows just how relevant and hip we are, and ahead of the game. So yeah, that's what we do with Row House. We are coming off of 10 years. This is like our 11th year. So we had an amazing year despite COVID. We had forums in here. It's our first one that's maskless, and we're actually close to each other. And we're really excited. I'm excited for this to be like, this is our normal vibe. So welcome, especially if you're here for the first time. Welcome. Thanks for coming out. And there's bathrooms, by the way. Go through this door, go to the left if you need a restroom. And the way the forum works is, it's a bit casual. We do allow our speaker to speak at length, 35, 40, 45 minutes, so you can get a substantial dose of ideas. And so we ask that you hold your questions, of course, but if you need to use the restroom, you want to grab more coffee, just do it quietly. And we are live streaming all over people, if there's people out there, maybe not yet, but we will be live streaming it. But don't be bashful. If you need something, get up and do it. Come on in, find a seat. We try to keep it cash that way. And then when the Q&A hits, we'll let that go as long as you're interested. And I have a feeling it's a pretty engaged audience. So anyway, so we've had 10 years of this. Last year was awesome. We had, probably 8 or 9 forums. We had 10 or 12 special events celebrating 10 years on the 10th of each month. We just had our last one, June 10th at Fry's Greenhouse. It was just a party, and we collaborated with a cidery and a brewery and a good caterer. We had a mechanical bull. I mean, it was the best night ever at Fry's Greenhouse. That's what we do. We engage current culture and age of faith. We have fun. We have some food. We have Lancaster cupcakes, so come on. We got some Square One coffee, decaf, so help yourself. But again, that's the main thing. Oh, what's coming up? What's coming up, Tom? So we're done with our season after tonight. And I'm already planning the next season, which begins in September. You may have seen some of the slides. Really psyched that our big fish for the year is Ann Snyder. She's a really sharp cultural commentator, very savvy with political ideas. She's what we call a heavy cat in the cultural engagement realm. And she's editor of Comment magazine, and just really has a passion for people of faith working for the common good. Passion for finding middle ground with people. What does it mean to be a good citizen in America? And through all of the turmoil of this past year, she just plowed the course of grace and truth and beauty, and I am so privileged that she said yes to come and speak. And so we'll come in September. That's our big fish. And then we have some other great stuff planned in the year to come through May of next year. So, and the other big news is I won't be curating these things on the ground. My very trustworthy curator intern is Kristen Fieldhouse. Raise your hand, Kristen. She's right there. And so you will see more of her in the coming year. If not online, maybe up front here a little bit, but she'll also be putting some people up front. And but will be the go-to person for Row House activities in Lancaster, as I will be on a study leave for a year. And even if I'm in town, I'll be trying to just focus on writing and reflecting on the past 11 years and making Row House better, figure out what that looks like, and just resting a bit, doing some restorative work with my wife and traveling, going to conferences. I have some speaking engagements lined up, and I'll be traversing a lot of the country. So if you know people around the country that do creative work in this area of Christians working for the common good, doing creative things, set me up with them, and I'll love to meet them and take them to coffee, or maybe speak for them, or find any way I can serve. So that'll be starting in July. I'll be starting my study leave. But I will be in town some of the time, and I'll be reachable, but I won't be doing events. So that'll be fun. And and the next event, actually, she just walked in, Leslie Buster with a white shirt. She will be speaking here in this gallery, a collaborative event with the Square Halo Gallery, to talk about this artist Rouault and his important work in the 20th century, correct? She'll be giving a little talk about him and his work, and that'll be just a nice little gathering on July 3rd, right?
Yes.
July 3rd.
First Friday of July.
Yeah. So we're going to put that on our site, and they'll be advertising that. And we're looking for something to do in July and want to engage with ideas and beauty. That's the place to come in July. And then September we'll be up and running with our Row House events. So tonight you're here to hear Alain Weaver, and I'm grateful that he's here tonight. He came by recommendation of one of our board members, Kristen Zimmerman. We worked with him, and what a pedigree! I mean, right now he's the director of strategic planning at the Mennonite Central Committee. He served previously as co-representative for Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq at the Mennonite Central Committee, and was a project coordinator in the Gaza Strip. That means you were in the Gaza Strip. Okay. By the way, how many people here have been to Palestine, with what they call the Holy Land? I mean, I've not. Okay, cool. Great. If you haven't been, you can't ask any questions tonight. You're a newbie. Just sit and listen. No, you can ask questions. And I'll get to how we handle questions after he talks. We have some really strict rules for that, especially such a volatile topic. But his PhD is in theology at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and we love theology at the Row House, by the way. I do anyway. He's the author of a bunch of articles and publications. He'll tell you the name of his book and where to get it in a moment. But we're here to hear him speak about the land, sort of take a step back and talk about history and talk about the land and what's going on in Israel. What does it mean to belong to the land? So let's give a good Lancaster County welcome to Alain Weaver.
Making sure I know what I'm doing there on that front. Hey, it's wonderful to be with all of you this evening. And thank you, Tom, for the wonderful welcome. I'm looking forward to an evening of good conversation. I'd like us to begin with an acknowledgement that our gathering is being held on traditional land of Native peoples. In the 1600s and 1700s, land in this area was home to the Susquehannock, Shawnee, Nanticoke, Piscataway, and Lenape nations. Earlier, before the late 1500s, Algonquin people lived in this area. We remember with sorrow the suffering of those who once had thriving villages in this land. We remember with gratitude their care for the land on which we now stand, and we recognize the ongoing indigenous presence in the land. Beginning with a land acknowledgement is particularly appropriate for our topic this evening as we reflect on what it means to belong to land and how to think theologically about that belonging. Specifically, we'll be thinking together about belonging in one particular territory, namely the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea that I'll refer to as Palestine, Israel. I won't in this talk give a comprehensive overview of the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or offer a thorough analysis of recent developments, although we can discuss some of those things in the question and answer time. Instead, my focus in this talk will be narrower, but still I think illustrative. I'll look at a particular case study, the destroyed Palestinian village of Kafr Birim in the northern Galilee, with a focus on the role trees have played in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the uprooting and planting of trees, memories of trees as symbols of belonging and as symbols of hope. This case study will help us reflect on what it would take for Palestinians and Israelis to live, in the words of the prophet Micah, under vine and fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. But before looking at trees, some initial thoughts about how not to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Over the course of 11 years of work in Palestine, Israel, and 3 decades of reflection on what might make for a durable, just peace for Palestinians and Israelis, I found some ways of talking about the conflict to be particularly unhelpful, and I will start by sharing those here. First, don't deny Jewish or Palestinian attachment to the land. Approaches to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that deny the existence of one of the parties or that reject as inauthentic the bonds one of the parties feels to the land are not constructive and don't make for peace. In extreme forms, this type of denial is wedded to political visions of expelling, or euphemistically put, transferring the other party from the land. To be sure, the recognition by both parties of each other's existence and the reality of their attachments to the land doesn't by itself dictate answers to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Should common attachment to the land be expressed through two separate nation states, as in a so-called two-state solution, through shared citizenship in one state, or through some other configuration? People of goodwill can and do differ on questions like that. But mutual recognition of one another's bond to the land is an essential prerequisite to any durable resolution to the conflict. Second, avoid anti-Semitic, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim stereotypes. It should go without saying that one should refrain from using harmful stereotypes. Yet in speaking in church, academic, and other settings about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I have often been distressed by how people resort to such stereotypes. Palestinians are tarred with anti-Muslim and anti-Arab stereotypes of being inherently violent or irrational. Anti-Semitic visions of Jewish control over politics, culture, and the economy are invoked. As with all stereotypes, these racist portrayals of Jews and Palestinians both preclude a clear, sober assessment of reality and actively perpetrate harm. Third, don't assume that Palestinians and Israeli Jews are homogeneous. Like all groups of people, Israeli Jews and Palestinians represent a wide diversity of perspectives and histories, be it diversity of religious convictions and practice, political commitments, localized identities, family backgrounds, and much more. Palestinian and Israeli Jewish identities are richly diverse. While it's inevitable in a talk like this to refer to large group identities such as Israeli Jewish or Palestinian, let's remember that behind such large group identities stand complex realities. Don't conflate Judaism and Zionism. Do recognize diversity within Judaism and Zionism. Not all Jews are Zionists. Some Jewish groups, like the Satmar Hasidim, oppose Zionism as blasphemous, arguing that the establishment of a divinely approved Jewish state will only occur with the arrival of the Mashiach, or Messiah. Other Jewish groups critique Zionism as conflicting with prophetic calls for justice in the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible, what Christians have traditionally called the Old Testament. Some Jews are non-Zionist, in that Zionism is simply not part of their Jewish identity. Others are anti-Zionist, actively opposing Zionism on Jewish grounds. Just as the diversity of perspectives among Jews regarding Zionism should be recognized, so should the diversity of thought among self-identified Zionists be acknowledged. Some versions of Zionism have been religious, others secular, and others not bound to the project of state building. Don't assume that critiques of the State of Israel and Zionism are anti-Semitic. Advocates for the State of Israel and of Zionism often portray criticisms of Israeli state actions and Zionism as anti-Semitic. Labeling anti-Zionism or criticisms of Israeli state policies as inherently anti-Semitic is factually incorrect, seeks to block critical thought, and distracts from the very real problem of anti-Semitism within rising right-wing nationalist movements globally, including here in the United States. Don't decontextualize acts of violence. The first thoughts many people have of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are specific acts of deadly violence. The Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip, Hamas rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel. For Christians, each death resulting from these acts of violence are things to be mourned as the loss of people created in God's image. Yet a focus on specific acts of violence can lead to a distorted analysis of the conflict. First, because such a focus decontextualizes specific acts of violence from their broader histories. And second, because a focus on deadly, extraordinary violence can lead us to overlook the ways in which state power operates within Israel and the occupied territories to dispossess Palestinians and to constrain Palestinian movement and economic possibilities through arbitrary detention, land confiscation, zoning restrictions, declaring certain areas to be closed military zones, and construction of and maintenance of a network of checkpoints and roadblocks, and much more. And finally, final don't. I feel sort of bad starting with all these don'ts. That's all right. Don't describe the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as an ancient conflict. Lazy pundits and comedians routinely make tired jokes about or reference to an intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict stretching back for centuries. Rather than being ancient, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a thoroughly modern phenomenon, stemming from the late 19th century, early 20th century. While indeed drawing upon and transforming Jewish eschatological hopes of a redemptive return to Zion, Zionism bears family resemblances to modern European nationalism and settler colonialism. Palestinian nationalism, meanwhile, emerges contemporaneously within modern Arab nationalist movements in the early 20th century. Not only are descriptions of this conflict as ancient and therefore intractable, historically mistaken, they draw upon racist stereotypes and harmful assumptions. The portrayal of ancient hatreds animating the conflict trade upon racist descriptions of Arabs in the so-called Middle East as particularly prone to violent, irrational conflict, in contrast to a supposedly less violent, more rational, and secular or Christian West. Further, talk of age-old enmity presents the Israeli conflict as uniquely intractable, with efforts to resolve or transform the conflict hopelessly doomed from the start. One can recognize the conflict's complexity and how that can breed despair while still holding out hope for the transformation of the conflict. Hope informed by the fact that other supposedly intractable conflicts in the modern era have undergone substantial transformation. So enough about don'ts and about how not to talk about the conflict. I'll try now to say something about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And as I promised, I'll do so by talking about trees. In 1992, my spouse and I went to teach English at a Catholic school in this northern West Bank village of Zababdeh in the Jenin district. It's the only predominantly Christian village in the northern West Bank. It's an agricultural town. Our first morning in the village, we were awoken by our landlord's children, offering us fresh fruit plucked from their family's fig tree. When I hear the prophet Micah's vision of a day in which God's people will sit under vine and fig tree with no one to make them afraid, I think of the many times drinking coffee flavored with cardamom or tea flavored with sage under our landlord's fig tree, and the grape trellis in front of the building's entrance, interrupted on occasion by Israeli military jeeps driving through town to announce curfew. Many families in Zababdeh cultivate olive trees, with the fruit processed into oil in the town's olive press and into pickles. We joined our landlord's family for the biannual olive harvest, a multi-generational, multi-day affair that schools closed for. Families took deep pride in their olive trees, their care for their trees binding them to the land. Picking olives with our landlord's family, we learned firsthand the organic role that olive trees and trees more generally play in the Palestinian national imagination. This is a painting by the prominent Palestinian artist Suleiman Mansour. The olive tree is routinely associated with the virtue of what Palestinians call in Arabic sumud, a patient resoluteness or steadfastness. In the hundreds, probably thousands of memory books produced by Palestinian refugees since 1948, trees routinely play a central role. My focus here is on the theological and autobiographical reflections of one uprooted Palestinian, Elias Shakur, a Palestinian priest with the Greek Catholic Church, whose family was uprooted in 1948 by Israeli military forces from the village of Kafar Birim in the northern Galilee, along the border with Lebanon. Birim, seen here in aerial view in 1945, was for centuries a Christian village with Mennonite and Greek Catholic families. It was one of over 400 Palestinian villages depopulated in 1948 in the course of what Israelis call the War of Independence and what Palestinians in Arabic name as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. On November 13, 1948, the Israeli military ordered the villagers to leave Birim, allegedly because of security concerns, promising that they'd be allowed to return after a few days. The village's 1,050 inhabitants were among the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians uprooted from their homes during the war. Over 2/3 of the Palestinian population lost their homes during the war. Some Birimites ended up as refugees in Lebanon, while others, like Shakur's family, were internally displaced persons in what became the new Israeli state, with most ending up in the nearby town of Jish. After weeks and then months passed without Birimites being allowed to return, the villagers petitioned the Israeli Supreme Court, which in 1952 upheld their right of return. The Israeli military responded on September 17, 1953, by placing explosive charges around the homes and bombing the village from the air, while the villagers looked on from a nearby hill. Over the coming years, Birim's ruins remained off limits to the expelled villagers as a closed military area, even as the Israeli state turned over portions of the village's land to 3 Jewish-only communities, Kibbutz Baram, Kibbutz Sasa, and Moshav Dovev. In the 1960s, Israel opened a national park and a nature reserve on top of Birim's ruins. Shakur, who had entered the newly opened park as a tourist in 1966, moved quickly through the toppled stones of the destroyed village, at first finding himself, in his words, once again a small boy, rushing home through the fig trees. Then he writes, any illusion of the past was broken as he surveyed the ravages of humanity and time. The family orchard itself was ruined, he writes. For some reason it had been deserted and now grew unpruned, except by the straying winds of God. The house too was a shambles. Overcome with emotion, Shakur begins to turn away from the rubble of his family home when something in the yard stopped me. There, firmly rooted and still green with life, grew my special fig tree. In Shakur's autobiographical mappings of his childhood village, trees form a central part of the remembered landscape. Furthermore, as we'll see, trees offer Shakur his key theological metaphor for reconciliation between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and for secure existence for all peoples in the land. In his first book, Blood Brothers, Shakur begins his narration as a 6-year-old boy, shirking his chores in the field, ensconced in the bough of a fig tree, his special hideaway as a child. Shakur's elder brother, Atullah, arrives to tell him that the boy's father, Michael, is buying a lamb, news which sets off fevered speculation as to what possible reason there might be for celebration. For typically the family only bartered for a lamb to roast for Easter celebrations. The remainder of the chapter, told from the perspective of an excited child, has the young Shakur scampering home through the village to find his father, to discover the reason for this unexpected feast. When the father eventually returns home that evening with lamb in tow, he gathers the children to tell them the village will be welcoming Jewish soldiers for up to a week. The lamb, he continues, will be slaughtered to welcome the soldiers into the village. The chapter offers only fleeting narrative foreshadowing of Birim's fate, as Shakur describes his older brother sitting stiffly quiet, his sister's face a mixture of emotions, a strange, chill mood that descends when the father tells them that the soldiers with guns will be staying in their homes, the surface calmness with which Shakur's parents prepare for the soldiers' arrival. The fig tree in which Shakur begins the chapter was sheltering an innocence about to be shattered, and stands in Shakur's memory as a paradise lost. The soldiers' stay, as Shakur and the reader soon discover, is not brief, and the villagers' hospitable gestures of surrender, perceived by the young Shakur as a celebration, fail to save Birim from the fate of nearby villages. The soldiers order the villagers to leave, offering what turn out to be empty promises they will be allowed to return. After the family has found shelter in the abandoned homes of refugees from a nearby village of Jish, Shakur's father and older brothers are rounded up on trucks and forced across the border into the Jordanian-controlled West Bank, only to infiltrate weeks later back into what's become Israel. The devastation and loss of the months and years which follow are encapsulated for Shakur's father, as for the young Shakur, by the loss of the family's fig orchard. Upon hearing that the fig orchard, expropriated along with all of Birim's land by the state, had been purchased by a settler as an investment, Shakur writes that, "Father's face furrowed with grief. I was terrified that he would weep. He was still, his eyes shut, his mustache drooping above a faintly trembling lip. He had planted those fig trees himself, one by one, straining with heavy clay jars of water up the steep slopes, caring for each sapling until it was strong enough to survive on its own. They were almost like children to him." After overcoming the initial shock, Mikhail, like many of his fellow villagers, agreed to work as a day laborer in his former orchard. "Father persuaded us that we, the true owners, would care properly for our beautiful trees and keep them safe and healthy for the next year. Foreigners with no relation to the trees would break the branches, take the fruit, and kill the trees. Shakur forefathers had planted these trees, tended them, and passed them on to us. People in our generation plant trees for their children's children. It was too much to think of these precious trees being neglected or even destroyed by uncaring strangers." Mikhail Shakur's insistence that only the true owners could properly care for the trees sounds a common theme of Palestinian refugee memory and writing. After 3 years as a day laborer in the orchards, however, Mikhail quit, finding the experience of becoming, in his words, a hewer of wood and a drawer of water, referencing the book of Joshua, on his own land to be humiliating. "Our personal dignity, our very soul, was too much to sacrifice," writes Shakur. "If the trees were destroyed when we returned," Father said, "we would plant new ones and begin all over." For Mikhail, the hope of return to the village was intimately intertwined with Birim's trees. "Will the government allow us to go back soon?" the aged Mikhail asks his son on his deathbed. "Will they help us rebuild our homes and regain our olive and fig trees? Will I be able to die in Birim where I was born?" Return for Mikhail meant being able to live in a rebuilt Birim. "If my fondest wish could be granted," he tells Ilyas, "I would go back to Birim alive and rebuild our house, the house I inherited from my forefathers. I would sit under the fig tree of the front of our house, and even if it were only for one day, I would die a happy man." For Shakur, as for his father, trees and other plant metaphors that stress the rootedness of Biramites serve to counter Zionism's ideological portrayals of Palestine as an empty land or a wasteland. We were not like some weed newly sprung up after rain, Shakur insists, but our spiritual heritage was firmly rooted in the first century. From his father, Shakur learned that we should love and respect our Galilean soil, for our people had long struggled to survive here. We were rooted like the poppies and wild blue irises that thrust up among the rocks. Our family had tilled this land, had worshipped here longer than anyone could remember. To claim as Biramites, and Shakur do, that we belong to the land is thus to assert one's presence in the face of an exclusionary ideology. The planting and uprooting of trees assert connection to and control over land. The Israeli state plants trees to cover over traces of prior habitation. Palestinians plant trees in an effort to prevent Israeli military authorities from confiscating land. Israeli settlers in the West Bank burned down Palestinian trees to stake their own claims. Oak, fig, olive, and pomegranate trees become sites of memory for Palestinian refugees. As we listen to Shakur's theological meditations about trees, we can ask what types of visions for the future reflections about trees can produce. Is a tree-focused imagination necessarily bound up with exclusivist claims over land, tied up with mapping that encodes given spaces as either Palestinian or Israeli Jewish? Or might imagination about trees produce landscapes of mutuality that accept, even embrace, the complex character of shared space? To be sure, some reflection about trees and plants not only asserts rootedness in the land, but is also linked to the uprooting of others. The psalmist, for example, offers a striking image of rootedness for the practice of clearing out a territory in order to implant another people. The psalmist writes, "You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took deep root and filled the land." In the 20th century, meanwhile, tree planting and deracination by the Israeli state and parastate institutions like the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, or the Israel Nature and Natural Parks Protection Authority, or NPA, have played key roles in the attempts to transform the landscape and to cover over former Palestinian habitation, including the ruins of Birim. While the JNF's image in the West is primarily associated with tree planting, for Palestinians, including Biramites, it represents an agency of expropriation through surveying and mapping. JNF workers surveyed Birim's land prior to parts of it being turned over to Kibbutz Baram. The National Parks Authority has also been instrumental in the transformation of the destroyed Palestinian landscape into Israeli space through the greening of that space. Birim, for example, is one of over 120 destroyed Palestinian villages over which tourism and recreation sites operated by the NPA and the JNF have been established. The way in which tree planting, and that's a sign in front of Birim, I got lost on the slides there. The way in which tree planting is used by parastate groups like the JNF and the NPA to cover over traces of prior Palestinian habitation is illustrated here in a series of slides of the West Bank village of Imwas, one of the sites traditionally associated with the biblical Emmaus. After Israel's conquest of the West Bank in 1967, the Israeli military expelled the villagers of Imwas as well as the nearby villages of Beit Nuba and Yalu. A few years, and then proceeded to destroy the homes and other buildings of the villages. A few years after Imwas's destruction, the Israeli state turned over the confiscated land to the Israel National Parks Authority. So here we just see it 1 year after the destruction, comparing it back to here. And then today, well, it's actually from 1988, I believe, but today it's like this. Few visitors to the Canada Alain Park realized that less than 45 years ago, the park's land was the site of a thriving Palestinian village. While tree planting and the greening of space serve as Israeli forms of territorial control and the erasure of Palestinian presence, trees also figure prominently within the Palestinian political imagination and in discourses and practices of internally displaced Palestinians like the villagers of Birim. So we've heard already, for example, of the role that the family fig orchard played in Elia Shakur's memories of the village. When internally displaced Palestinians within Israel like Shakur make return visits to their sites of their destroyed villages, plants like the sabah, or the prickly pear cactus, or fruit-bearing trees such as olives, fig trees, and pomegranates stand out as signposts for the reconstruction and maintenance of the refugees' mental maps. Sabah, the prickly pear cactus, was often planted as property lines by Palestinians. This is the church in the rebuilt church in the destroyed village of Birim. Even as the villagers displaced from Birim have been prevented by the Israeli state from returning to their land, they have fought to maintain connection to it, holding weddings and funerals in the village's reconstructed church. Trees have also played a central role in one of the primary ways in which Birimites transmit communal memories in order to strengthen local and Palestinian national identity, such as summer camps organized for young children and youth descended from the original inhabitants. In the mid-1980s, Birimites pioneered these roots and belonging camps, in their words, note the tree imagery. In these camps, community elders lead children in cooking traditional foods and singing folkloric songs in a resurrection of a village life in the present. Frequent location for camp activities include two favored sites of Birimite memory, in and around the village church and under trees. The young camp participants are called bara'im in Arabic, a word meaning buds, and coincidentally a word that shares the same root as the village name, Birim. It's another vegetative metaphor deployed to emphasize the organic connection of the villagers to the land and the bond of generation to generation. Trees have also been part of protests by Shakur and other Birimites to press for their right of return to Birim. On February 17, 1979, Shakur led a march of the village's children from Jish to the Birim site, with marchers carrying olive saplings to plant. The protest coincided with the Jewish holiday of Tu B'Shvat, a day on which the Jewish National Fund plants trees with donations from the Jewish diaspora. Children of Birim, are you ready to bring life and peace to your village? Shakur asks the marchers as they prepare to walk to the village to plant the tree saplings. The Israeli military proceeds to turn the march back, declaring the area to be a closed military zone. And in protest, the Committee for the Uprooted of Kafar Birim send the saplings by mail to the Prime Minister's office and to Knesset members. Some Israeli Jews joined the displaced Birimites in these protests. For Shakur, these joint demonstrations witness to a future of peace and reconciliation through justice for displaced refugees. As he surveyed the scores of Israeli Jews and Palestinians gathered amongst Birim's ruins during a 6-month-long sit-in in the 1970s, Shakur reported that he, quote, felt unearthly, as if I were living in a vision. The hot summer morning stretched into a long, cool evening, and I rushed about, helping volunteers to settle amidst the fallen stones and timbers. The sky darkened, and still a vibrance drove me. Voices mixed with laughter, women cooked over blazing wood fires, girls and boys played beneath the olive trees again. The gathering also stood for Shakur as the fulfillment of a vision he had had of Palestinian-Israeli-Jewish reconciliation as a seminarian in Haifa in 1952. An image of him resurrected beneath the ancient olive trees, of all the ransacked homes restored, and the women safe within, Palestinian and Jew sipping coffee together again in tranquil conversation. To understand Shakur's theological interpretation of this reconciliation, let's return to the fig tree which captured Shakur's gaze upon his return to Birim's ruins in the late 60s. This isn't that tree, this is a fig tree in the West Bank village of Silwand. The tree, Shakur remembers, was the product of his father having grafted branches from 5 different varieties of figs into the trunk of a 6th variety. Beneath the rough bark where my hand rested, I knew that the living wood had fused together so perfectly that should I cut the tree down, I could never see where one variety stopped and the other began. Standing under his childhood fig tree, Shakur engages in his most sustained biblical exposition and explicit theological analysis. The tree's grafted branches not only exhibit the practical historical lesson that Shakur learned from his father, namely, quote, that Palestinian Arab lives were bound up with the other people who inhabited the land of Palestine, the Jews. We had suffered together under the Romans, Persians, Crusaders, and Turks, and we learned to share the simple elements of human existence: faith, reverence for life, hospitality. The tree also drives home for Shakur the meaning of Paul's proclamation: the Jew and Gentile have been reconciled through Jesus Christ, the dividing wall between them broken down, in the words of Ephesians. For Shakur, Paul's message of reconciliation in Ephesians, in Galatians 3, and in Romans chapters 9 through 11, where the grafting metaphor takes center stage, means that we Gentiles have been grafted in among God's chosen people, just as Father had grafted 6 different kinds of fig trees together to make a delightful new tree. Palestinians, including the people of Kafar Birim, may have, in Shakur's word, been cut off like unwanted branches by Israeli policies and laws of dispossession and exclusion. But in God's vision, Shakur discovers, Palestinians and Israeli Jews are intertwined with one another in one body. In Shakur's reading of Romans 9 through 11, Gentiles are not grafted in at the expense of Jews, a reading which fits well with Paul's hopeful insistence that the natural branches, the natural Jewish branches, will be grafted back into God's cultivated olive tree, alongside grafted in Gentile branches. The people of Israel's election is not a matter of pride or boasting, Shakur contends, but properly understood demands openness to God's surprising action of incorporating the foreigner and the eunuch into God's people. For Shakur, taking his cue from the prophet Isaiah, an integral part of God's intention to hold up his new Israel as a banner of justice before all the nations of the world is the joining of the foreigner to the people Israel. God's Israel included foreigners, Shakur writes, those who were not only the fleshly tribes of Israel, but those who had been grafted into his family, just as the branches had been grafted into the fig tree. Shakur proceeds to affirm Jewish rootedness in the land alongside Palestinian rootedness. Come, let us be brothers and sisters together in this beautiful land, of which all of us have history and roots, he presents his father and fellow Birimites, saying to Israeli Jews. There is room enough for all of us. Aren't we all the co-persecuted brothers and sisters? Shakur's vision of a shared space in which Palestinians and Israeli Jews both sit secure under vine and fig tree is a moving one, yet the realization of this vision seems more distant than ever. In the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods of Jerusalem today, scores of Palestinian families face being forcibly expelled by the Israeli state, the most recent instance of what Palestinians experience as an ongoing, over 7-decade-long Nakba, or catastrophe. Muna el-Kurd, shown here as a member of one of the families in Sheikh Jarrah, in danger of losing her home. Artists seeking to portray the sumud, or steadfast determination, of the Sheikh Jarrah families turn to plant images, as with this drawing showing prickly pear cactus leaves inscribed with the names of the Sheikh Jarrah families facing expulsion. During the past 3 decades since the Oslo Peace Accords, the construction of walls, electrified fences, roadblocks, Israeli-only road networks, and Israeli-only settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem have confined Palestinians to increasingly fragmented and ever smaller parcels of land. And the Gaza Strip, meanwhile, is blockaded from all sides, with over 2 million people living in what human rights groups have called the world's largest open-air prison. Prospects for a 2-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with an Israeli state alongside a Palestinian one, have evaporated. Instead, one sovereign state, Israel, controls all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, ruling over 5 million stateless Palestinians. Both a 2-state solution of an independent Palestine along an independent Israel and a 1-state solution of equality for Israeli Jews and Palestinians within one state seem equally distant and unlikely at present. A vision of Palestinians and Israeli Jews living freely and securely under vine and fig tree can seem like a cruel illusion in the face of such conditions. It's hard to find reasons for hope within these present-day realities. One place that I do find reasons for hope, albeit a fragile hope, is in the actions of Israelis and Palestinians who collaborate to cast forth alternative visions to the ongoing uprooting and confinement of Palestinians. Take, for example, Birimites who create visions of what a reconstructed Birim might look like, or who draw up maps that envision a rebuilt Birim living alongside the Israeli settlements built on its land. Or take the Israeli group Zochrot, whose Hebrew name means the ones who remember. Zochrot's members are dedicated in their words to remembering the Nakba in Hebrew, to provoking discussion within Israeli Jewish society about the destruction and dispossession on which the Israeli state was built, and to make visible the Palestinian landscape that Israeli practices have covered over and have sought to erase. Zochrot organizes trips to the sites of destroyed Palestinian villages to hear testimonies from Palestinian refugees about their villages, and to post signs like this one in Hebrew and Arabic to remember the people who once lived there and to envision a binational future for the land. For Israelis and Palestinians working against the politics of dispossession and for a just peace for all peoples in the land, artistic visions and embodied actions like these offer a foretaste of what reconciled existence under vine and fig tree might look like, and are essential to sustain hope and commitment in working towards such a future. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Well, now it's time to get involved with some Q&A. And what's the name of your recent book on this?
Inhabiting the Land, Thinking Theologically About the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict.
Inhabiting the Land. And where can these people find this book?
Whitman stock, but you can also find it on Amazon.
Whitman stock, Amazon. Check it out. go for a deeper dive. Thank you so much, that was really great. I especially enjoyed the tree metaphor and kind of giving us that visual, so key and everything. So I'm sure you're sitting on a lot of questions. And I want to remind you that if you need to get up during this time, feel free to just be respectful. Use the restroom if you need to. If you came in late and didn't get checked in by me, come see me. That'd be nice to know who you are. And I think I got most of you. But as far as questions go, yeah, what we do is we do try to limit it to questions. We really appreciate your concerns and opinions and ideas. And if you have a little bit of a soapbox tonight, I'm sure that Alan would be glad to bend his ear to you after the Q&A, and you can give him further comments if you so wish. But we really want to, excuse me, keep this to questions, actually. Keep them brief. Let's be learners. Let's have our ears tuned into learning and ask honest questions. Don't be bashful. Ask whatever you wish. But
let's go back to a more representative slide here. Let's do that.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So, and we can start with clarification questions, just clarifying its points, right to theological things, right to newsworthy items. That's fine with me. Just keep it brief. Raise your hand. We'll call you out, and we'll sit down.
All right, got one already.
Yeah, when you say Palestinian, what is the religious makeup? Are they Christians? Are they Muslims? Or are they different?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the 20th century, historians, demographers say the Palestinian population was around 10% Palestinian. Today, it's inside the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It's probably, the Palestinian population is probably 2% is Christian, and the rest is Sunni Muslim. There aren't any Shia Muslim in any meaningful number. There inside Israel, it might, the percentage of the Palestinian population, or what Israel refers to as Israeli Arabs, might be slightly higher, but it certainly wouldn't be more than 5% of the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And then you have plenty of Palestinians in the diaspora as refugees, in refugee camps in the Middle East, but then also you had Palestinian Christians and Muslims moving to the U.S. and Latin America, across Latin America in the late 19th, early 20th century. The current president of El Salvador is of Palestinian background. And a lot of Palestinian Christian communities as well in Latin America. Yeah.
And you said there's 5 million stateless Palestinians living.
So the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, yeah, there's a Palestinian Authority that has control over civilian affairs in parts of the West Bank, but it's not an independent sovereign state. And it's a member state of the United Nations, but it's not recognized as an independent sovereign state. So there's one sovereign state that rules over all of this land, but then you have 5 million Palestinians in Gaza Strip, around 2 million plus, and then in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, over 3 million more. Yeah. And then over here.
When we hear the term two-state solution,
Yeah.
what, is that like a geographic thing, like let's divide the land, or is it more like you have two governments coexisting in the same space, which is
No, that's a
kind of
good question.
catastrophic?
That's really great. It's the first one. And so when, like I'll speak from the Palestinian perspective here. When Palestinians signed the Oslo Accords, when the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, signed the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s, it envisioned this as something that would lead towards the creation of an independent Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, or along the 1967 lines, or what's often referred to as the Green Line. I should have really put some map slides on, but I didn't do that. So When Palestinians have talked about the UN resolutions 242, I used to know these numbers, I think it's 338, called for a two-state solution. It was understood to be in, a Palestinian state within these territories occupied by Israel in 1967. But starting in the late 1960s, Israel began, creating settlements in the Gaza Strip, in East Jerusalem, and in the West Bank, and more of those, and confiscating more and more land, making that type of two-state solution seem ever less likely. So Palestinians understood when they signed the Oslo Accords in the 1990s that this would lead in that direction of a two-state solution along those lines. But instead, settlement construction continued, construction of settlement-only road networks continued in the West Bank. Israel did remove the few thousand settlers that were in the Gaza Strip. What was that, 2006, 2007? So you had like around 4,000, 3,000 to 5,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip amidst probably at that time, 1.3 million Palestinians. But with those settlements and the Israeli military apparatus around those settlements basically controlling around 40% of what's already a very small territory of the Gaza Strip. So those were removed, but in international law still views the Gaza Strip as occupied territory. The new Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, a few years ago, in reference to the peace process, said, "You talk, we'll keep building." And one of the advisors to former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon referred to the peace process as putting a two-state solution into formaldehyde. And so in many ways, from a Palestinian perspective again, the peace process has served as cover for the ongoing Israeli settlement enterprise in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and one that separates out the north from the south of the West Bank, separates out different parts of the West Bank from each other, and any of those parts can be cut off at any point through networks of checkpoints, roadblocks, and more, which makes the reality of a Palestinian state seem ever more distant. Ariel Sharon, near the end of his premiership, was starting to say, hey, we can embrace the idea of a two-state solution if it's sort of one that we impose and say, okay, we have walled you into, cut you into this fragmented geographical reality. If you want to call that a state, feel free. But it's one that no Palestinian leadership could accept. But yeah, so you said, is it like two sovereign states over the same territory? I mean, there have been different creative visions amidst the current despair? I mean, is the horizon, even starting in the late 1990s, you had different Palestinian leaders, Jordanian leaders, issuing warnings that, the two-state solution is about to be eclipsed. In some ways, some Palestinians would say that ended up becoming like crying wolf. I mean, it's always being eclipsed, and the worse and worse it gets. And so you have some Palestinians, and even a minority, and an even smaller minority of Israelis who then would argue for a one-state solution of shared citizenship of all the people in the land. But that seems equally distant, yes.
Well, I heard that,
I'm sorry, you have a question too.
maybe before me. I'm gonna pick up on Bennett.
With some of the worldwide anti-Semitism going on,
Sure.
it seems like there has been a significant increase in welcoming of Israel, of Jews from all over the world. And with that massive influx, sort of like a reporter, they sort of have indicated what they're doing is to try and make room for the sheer number of people that are coming into the country that are Jewish.
Mhm. That are Jewish, is it?
Yeah, Jewish people coming into Israel
Right.
from the rest of the world. And how do you look at trying to accommodate those in a relatively small, isn't Israel like the size of New Jersey?
Bigger than that, but it's like if you take the state of Kansas,
Okay.
you can fit the state of Israel within Kansas. I mean, you can fit the whole land of Palestine, Israel within Kansas. Yeah, so it's not huge.
And with that much increase in population, is that why they're increasing their land mass or?
Yeah, well, I mean, Israel offers different justifications for its settlement enterprise. I mean, some of the settlers are there because of government makes housing available at subsidized rates in the settlement, so it's cheaper to live there than in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or in West Jerusalem. Others settle in the West Bank because of religious reasons. I said in the beginning about how there's different types of Zionists, secular Zionists, religious Zionists, so definitely some are motivated by a vision of settling the land as a religious act, and the West Bank being seen by these settlers as sort of the core of the Jewish homeland, being referred to as Judea and Samaria. And then the Israeli state would also say, well, the settlement enterprise is about security. And so a routine thing that Israeli politicians would do would be trying to convince the United States politicians of the importance of supporting the Israeli state would be to take them on helicopter tours of the West Bank and see how small it is, and see, this is why we have to have these settlements so that we can strategically control this territory. You certainly do have, I haven't read too much about there being a big influx right now of big uptick, like really big uptick in Israel of Jews making aliyah to Israel. Aliyah is the Hebrew term simply for immigration to Israel. It's a Hebrew word that actually means to go up. So it's already, even though it's a secular Hebrew Israeli word, it connotes this sort of spiritual ascent, going up to the holy mountain type of thing. You had a big influx in the 70s, 80s of Jews from the Soviet Union who were coming in and to Israel. That was like a major influx. You had some coming from Ethiopia also in the 80s. You also have phenomenon of Israeli Jews, certainly more on the secular end of things, leaving Israel just because they don't want to be bound up in the troubles of life there, and would rather live, say, in the United States or in Europe or somewhere else. So that's a long-winded response to your good question. The shorter answer would be, I don't think that the settlement construction is directly linked to the, Jewish immigration to the state of Israel.
The sovereign state with equal citizenship and shared power, is that part of Bennett's vision?
No.
Yeah. You think that it is? There's some that think.
He has been very critical of a two-state solution and is a strong proponent, as was his predecessor Benjamin Netanyahu, of Israeli control over the whole land. But he would not be for giving citizenship to Palestinians in Gaza or East Jerusalem or the West Bank. Yeah.
Hey, this is kind of a two-part question I'm trying to formulate. You had mentioned earlier there were some similarities between Zionism and European nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so could you unpack that? And then in context of that, what are the implications for American nationalism and our focus on Israel, particularly in the West?
Yeah, so European nationalism, sort of starts to form in the late 1700s, late 18th century. And with that, all nationalisms are modern creations, but with it goes like this search for, or claims to, like, deep rootedness of, and part of that is like a stress on language, like, we're French and we have the nation state of France and we speak French, and we've got these folk tales that go along with this and these other cultural markers that we're going to identify as being these quintessential Frenchness. Another part of it is religious. So being French means being Catholic, or being German means being Protestant. And then as part of that comes along different waves of, growing anti-Semitism, which then start to come to a head in the mid-19th century. And so then in the later 19th century, you have Zionism emerging among secular Jews in Europe, saying, hey, we're not going to be welcomed here in these new nation states of Europe. So just as the French have the French, because these are all constructs, just as the French have France and the Germans have Germany, so we Jews need a nation state. And so then and then the language is, I talked about it being settler colonialism. It's this language of colonialism is used just unapologetically and, without any seeming sense that it's problematic by someone like Theodore Herzl, one of the leaders of early Zionist movements. Now, how to connect that to the United States and its current reality? Both the United States as well as in many other parts of the world, you've got resurgent nationalisms. And of course that goes hand in hand with trying to police borders. It goes hand in hand with concerns about the purity of the people. And of course this can really get articulated in just blatantly racist ways. It can also get articulated in the less blatantly racist ways of Make America Great Again. And then certainly in the United States, there's been a resurgence of anti-Semitism as part of that, because where you have racist white nationalism, that goes hand in hand not just with racism against people of color, against African Americans, but also against Jews. And that's how I'd make that connection. And what you can often find among both the blatantly racist as well as the less blatantly racist forms of U.S. white nationalism is both an anti-Semitism as well as a philo-Zionism of, oh yeah, we love the state of Israel, and sort of unspoken, like, maybe all the Jews should go there, and like Trump just recently said, oh, I love Israel more than a lot of American Jews do, and sort of like making love of Israel as a marker of what it means to be a quote-unquote true Jew, which is just it's a subtle form of anti-Semitism. Yeah, I don't know, does that somewhat answer your question?
Yeah, it helps me to kind of connect the dots.
Yeah.
You mentioned some of the groups that have a primary goal of shared and common living or ideas like soup growth, and I'm wondering if there are other institutions that share that same primary goal, or as a secondary way that have common ground, be they educational or what have you, that you see as a road to the future for new generations.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Certainly there are other groups like that. First of all, you have Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem that is advocating for justice for Palestinians both within Israel as well as against the human rights abuses of the military occupation. You've got a community like Neve Shalom, Wahat Salam, which is actually very close to the ruins of Imwas, where one of the sites of biblical Emmaus that I showed the destruction of, was an intentional community founded in the mid to late 70s by a group of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel trying to live in a communal way. interesting community in the sense that lots of interesting tensions have developed as children in the community have grown up, and then the Israeli Jewish children, go into the army, which is, and there's mandatory conscription. You have a very small number of Israeli Jews who engage in conscientious objection. But so it's a tense situation, but it's an attempt to do that. You've got some examples of attempts to set up shared schools. There's one in Jerusalem that routinely gets a lot of anti-Arab graffiti painted on it. One in the town of Beersheba, or what Palestinians call Be'er Saba, in the Negev desert, or Naqab. That's an attempt to have schooling shared by Israeli Jews and Palestinians. So yeah, there's certainly attempts. What's the biggest obstacle to this, of course, is it's not possible it's very difficult for Palestinians to go into Israel itself, Palestinians in the occupied territories. So you've got attempts at this between Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel, but then things where like people from the West Bank with the Gaza Strip to then interact with Israeli Jews is much more difficult because to get into Israel they would need to apply for permits from the Israeli military government, and that's it's a whole can of worms and very difficult. And meanwhile, the state of Israel says it's illegal for Israeli Jews to go into Area A, which is like the Palestinian Authority areas of the West Bank. You do have some Israeli Jews who go in anyway, but that's an obstacle. The very beginning of the Oslo years in the early 90s, you had US, European governments putting a lot of money into people-to-people exchanges, but then those were usually ones where it would be like, well, taking Israeli Jews and Palestinians and going to Cyprus, or going to a summer camp in Maine, or other types of things were outside of the thing, and an attempt to be on a neutral space. But the criticism of those people-to-people exchanges from the Palestinian end was that the theory of change was, well, if we just bring people together, then that's going to take care of things. But the Palestinian perspective, it was artificially blocking off all of the structural power imbalances that were endemic to it, which were related to the fact that they weren't able to go into Israel to meet with Israeli Jews, or the Israeli Jews weren't allowed to go into the West Bank by their own government to meet with Palestinians. So again, a long answer to your very good question.
We have time for a couple more. Just real quick, you can give a quick answer to it. Why is it not in the interest of the Israeli state to just open up and share the land? Why are the checkpoints? What's their best defense of that?
Well, I mean, the main argument of against a one-state solution of equality, of equal citizenship in one state, is that going back to the late 19th century and the founding of the Zionist movement is that life as a minority in these European states is unsustainable. We're going to be discriminated against, best case scenario. Worst case scenario, it's pogroms, other types of violence against this community. Of course, this predated the Holocaust, which is an even more extreme example of the precariousness of Jewish life in European nation states. And so the mainstream Zionist vision is one of, we need demographic majority in a territory that we control. The problem with that is that the only way that such a state could have been created would have been through the involuntary displacement of the Palestinians there, because it was not an empty land, contrary to the either naive or disingenuous rhetoric. It wasn't a land without a people, for a people without a land, as one Zionist slogan went. And so the only way to create a state with a Jewish majority was going to be through the transfer of Palestinians. And then that happened in 1948. Yes, over here.
Actually, you answered a lot of the question that I had, because Tom and I shared a little bit of the same. I'm just wondering, do you see any path for these folks to go forward and live in that land and share those trees and live in peace? And how much does outside involvement exacerbate what these people live with every day? You know, if we would just let them settle it, might this be a little bit less complex?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a really great question. And, you know, if we say, so what would it mean to let them settle it and to not be involved? So the United States is massively involved through billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. So if that were to be cut off, I think that would be, it would involve a lot of rethinking. Now, I'm not saying that would automatically solve the situation, but the current reality is very much bankrolled and made possible. Certainly bankrolled and made more sustainable by the U.S.'s overwhelming support, both money-wise, militarily, politically, for the state of Israel and its current actions.
In 1948, wasn't it the United States? It was, I won't say necessarily the last vote, but the critical vote to actually create Israel?
Yeah, that's a good question. Short answer is I'm not 100% sure, but certainly, yeah, you said the United Nations votes on the partition plan in 1947. Before 1947, the British were in charge of, had been given a mandate by the League of Nations, and so was overseeing this territory. And so the British wanted out, and the United Nations stepped in and said, okay, we're going to divide the land between a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state. And it was like a proposed division of around 60% of the land would be for the new Israeli state, 40% of the land for this Palestinian Arab state, and then with Jerusalem, Bethlehem areas being this sort of international city type of enclave. And so yeah, the United States did definitely provide key support, but you know, along with this, with the Security Council, the other members of the Security Council as well, all voted for that. Yeah.
Just an observation that could be completely wrong. Followed up with a question I'd like to get your input on. Bring it back to the Christian church here. There seems to be, at least this is the observation, could be wrong. It seems from living here and seeing things, there's a strain of the Christian church that is so supportive of Israel. And they're pretty vocal about it. And then I believe there's a strain that's against it, that you don't hear that much about that. I'm thinking that you've thought about this much more. Why is this? And did you see a common thread running through why, if my observation is correct, that there's a strain within the Christian church, it's just like, you know, not Israel right or wrong, but practically. Well, do you see a common thread within there?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly there's very vocal proponents of the state of Israel among Christian churches. And there's differences in how they approach that and understand that. I mean, so what's referred to often as Christian Zionism, and there are a couple of different versions of it. One version would be something like that's popularized in like the Left Behind books that were those popular in like the very first part of this century, the visions of, you know, Armageddon and the state of Israel sort of having a key role in this, and a vision of you're going to have an influx of Jews to the state of Israel, and then Armageddon is going to happen, and then some Jews will, you know, convert to following Jesus, and the rest will go to hell. And so basically Jews in the state of Israel is like a pawn in this apocalyptic endgame. And that's a very influential strain in American politics. I mean, reading, you know, one person who made a very trenchant comment recently that there's way more Christian Zionists around the globe, including the United States, than there are Jews around the globe. And I mean, and it's not just in the United States. I mean, you can go to evangelical fundamentalist churches in Latin America, Africa, Asia. You find the Israeli flag in the sanctuary. I mean, it's a very strong part of that. You have another form, and you have other Christian Zionists who are also sort of on that evangelical, Pentecostal, fundamentalist end of things that also support the state of Israel, but don't quite have that same type of apocalyptic scenario. John Hagee, head of Christians United for Israel in the United States, megachurch pastor in Texas, I believe. He just was in Israel just a few days ago, along with Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to the United Nations under the Trump administration, who's apparently finding it will be a good way to prep for a potential presidential run. And they were visiting Benjamin Netanyahu, who's still in the prime minister's residence, even though he's no longer the prime minister. And they were being hosted by Netanyahu as if he was still the prime minister. And actually, I know this is going to be a long-winded answer to your question, but there has been a big brouhaha in the Israeli press just within the last week, because you had this American evangelical, I think the first name is Mike White, who's written like lots of books about Israel and how all evangelicals and good Christians should be supporting it. And he just wrote this, article in the Times of Israel about why Israel did you crucify Benjamin Netanyahu? And he's so wonderful. I mean, and he just rightly got called out for using all these anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as Christ killers and things like this. But so there's definitely a whole big strain of evangelical fundamentalist pro-Zionism. You also have another form of support for the state of Israel would be more found among mainline Protestant ones, which goes hand in hand with the post-Holocaust rethinking of Christian anti-Judaism, and thinking that in light of the Holocaust we need to rethink traditional teachings of repudiation of the Jewish people. Sort of two covenant types of theologies come out of this. You sort of have a mainline Protestant version of support for the state of Israel that's either vocally supportive, or at least we as Christians in the West have given up our right to criticize the state of Israel. And you have a Catholic variant of that.
Is there a part of the church that's critical?
Yeah, you definitely have among evangelical and mainline Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox churches, you definitely have versions that are critical. Yeah.
And they're like pro-Palestinian, more than critical, I find.
Yeah. Right. No. Yeah. And so, whether you call it pro-Palestinian, you call it pro-justice, in a situation of injustice and imbalance, if you call attention to the injustice and you call for rectification of the injustice, then is that being pro-Palestinian in terms of being anti-Israeli, or are you pro-equality?
Yeah. Pro-equality. Good way to end. We'll equally be ended in this moment. This is great stuff. Can we hear it? Some of you have to go, I'm sure, and some of you want some cupcakes, you want to hang out, meet somebody you didn't come in with, that's always a cool thing. And do you have a few minutes?
Oh yeah, I can hang out.
Come on up and form a line. He won't sign your book, because but if you get the book one day.
You can track me down.
Go on and get his book, but thank you so much, Alain.
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot.
And thank you all for coming tonight. Have a great summer, and have a great night.